Hello! Welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and what I'm presenting today is part 2 of a YouTube trilogy, I guess you could call, based on my essay entitled When to Retain the Group Name, Defining and Applying the Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple Paradigms. In part 1, what I do is sort of frame the argument, and that central argument is, when is it appropriate for a band to carry on with their name when key members have left or been replaced, etc.? I mean, there are times when it probably makes perfect sense that a band continues on with their name when there's been some changes. Other times it's maybe less justifiable, right? And so what I do in part 1 is I sort of describe what I mean by the Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple paradigms, because I think those bands are two great examples of the extremes. On one hand, you have Led Zeppelin, which Led Zeppelin is an example of a band that existed only as long as all of their original members were available, right? So when John Bonham died soon after the recording of In Through the Outdoor, Led Zeppelin ceased to be an ongoing recording and touring entity. All we've gotten from Led Zeppelin since then, I say all, it's still quite a bit, but have been reissues and remasters and compilations and etc., right? The only exception to this was a one-time concert in 2007 where Jason Bonham, John's son, played the drums, but it was only a one-time thing. But effectively, Led Zeppelin stopped when all 4 members were no longer available. On the other hand, you've got Deep Purple, right, at the other extreme, really. And Deep Purple's a great example of a band that has carried on since 1968. There was sort of a brief sort of timeout for Deep Purple, I guess you'd say, sort of in between Come Taste the Band and Perfect Strangers. But for most of the time since 1968 to the present, the name Deep Purple has been a going concern, but with many, many, many lineup changes and all kinds of different members coming and going. The only consistent member being drummer Ian Pace, right? So even though there's been all kinds of different lineups in Deep Purple, the Deep Purple moniker has continued nevertheless, right? And lots of bands have fallen somewhere in between, okay? So I sort of discussed those two extremes in part 1. And I guess one of the things that I came away with in part 1, when we're, again, trying to determine if it's appropriate for a band to carry on with their name or not when members come and go, I've always found the arguments that people tend to make as frankly being too subjective as far as I'm concerned. You know, that some people will voice their opinion that, well, this is really the only valid version of the band. And usually it's based on things like, well, they sold the most, or it's the version I like best, or what have you. I always found it just a little too subjective. Interesting discussion, nevertheless. And everybody's opinion, it's great to hear. But I was never really convinced of the approach that people were taking to determine, you know, if it was appropriate for a band to continue with their name or not. So what I'm doing, and this is sort of what I do in part 2 here in this second video, is sort of in my own humble little way, we move towards an actual framework, right? Which I believe is more objectively defines when it is appropriate for a band to continue on with their name, and perhaps circumstances where that makes less sense, right? So if you're following along with the actual text version, again, if you'd rather read the essay in its entirety, the links are provided below. And if you've done that, thank you so much for checking into this. I know it's a fairly lengthy paper. That's why I've divided these YouTube presentations into 3 parts, because to try to keep the presentations manageable. But if you are following along with me, or however you're doing this, we're at about page 7 in that particular essay. And so let's dig into this. So moving towards a framework. Okay, well, before I get to the framework, I got to say a couple of things just ahead of time here. A couple of disclaimers, I suppose. So first off, I realize that if one adheres to the original members only argument, then really you don't need this framework. You don't need any framework, like really, because, you know, that position is pretty cut and dried. There's not a whole lot to discuss there. I.e., if you adhere specifically to what Led Zeppelin did, if you think that's really how it should be, and as soon as original members are no longer present, then the band should be called something else, or you don't recognize the band as the same. I mean, fair enough. I mean, it's a perfectly valid position to have, or there are some people who have that position. But for me personally, I've always found that approach perhaps a little simplistic. But I think its biggest problem is that it's just not practical. At least it's not practical enough for me. And the best example I can give for the problem with the original members only approach, although you don't need a framework and it is simple, I'm not sure what you do with bands such as Rush, for example. So, for most people are going to recognize Rush as, Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart, right? But if you hold the purist view, i.e. that it can only be original members, right? Well, then technically, right, Rush ends after the first album because, of course, Neil wasn't on the first album. It was John Rutsey, right? So technically, Rush should have to be called perhaps something else by the time they get to Fly By Night, their second album. Now, here's the problem. I don't know anybody who thinks that. Like, virtually anyone you ever talk to, whether they're hardcore Rush fans or just a casual fan of the band, they're going to recognize Rush as Geddy, Alex, and Neil, right? But as I say, if you're sticking strictly to the purist view, they can only be original members. Well, then you have a problem with Rush, essentially, right? Okay, so I don't know how you square that circle. So in my view, there is a need for a framework because I'm not sure that the purist view that original members only is going to be practical in a lot of instances. Okay. Second disclaimer that I want to make, and I recognize that these types of discussions are, can come off as sounding a little bit arrogant, and I truly hope that's not how I'm sounding. That's certainly not how I'm intending things. And what do I mean by that? I guess what I'm saying is, what gives me or anybody, frankly, the right to tell, somebody like, say, Mick Box, that he was somehow mistaken for carrying on with the Uriah Heep name, right? Well, no one should be telling Mick Box anything. I mean, if he feels it's the right choice to make and he has the legal rights to the Uriah Heep name and he's going forward, more power to Mick Box and everyone like Mick, every musician like Mick that's held on to the name, regardless of what others may think. So of course, none of this should be taken too seriously, right? I don't want to imply for a second that I know anything more than anyone else, because of course I do not know anything more than anyone else. I don't want to come off as some elitist or anything like that. This is purely just sort of a fanboy sort of exercise. And I guess, like I say, in my own little way, I'm trying to add maybe a little objectivity to the discussion. That's all. Okay. And one last little disclaimer before we look at this little framework I've put together. Suggesting that a band, and I'm going to make this suggestion in some cases, that it may have been more appropriate if a band's name would have been retired for reasons I'll get into. But just because a band's name, I'm going to say, in some cases, a band's name should have been retired, that doesn't mean that the music they created going forward is somehow invalid. Okay. So again, returning again to say the Uriah Heep example, personally, I'm forever grateful for the multitude of incredible albums that Mick and the band have produced for decades. Frankly, the run of albums between Sea of Light, including Sea of Light, from 1995 to Living the Dream, their most recent album, 2018, are masterpieces. Absolute awesome albums. If you're the type of, whether you like Uriah Heep or not, or if you're just a fan of, say, heavier prog type rock, check these things out. They're amazing, right? So, but I'm going to make the argument that I'm not convinced these albums should have been called Uriah Heep. But like I say, that doesn't mean they're not amazing albums, because they are completely amazing albums. Okay, so In what circumstances can the continuation of the band name be most easily justified when band members leave? Okay, so here's the big thing here for me anyway. In my view, the weighting should be placed on the creation of the music and less so on performance. And I think in this discussion, the implication has actually been the opposite. We put too much weight on performance, not enough on music creation, okay? The key creators within a band are first and foremost the songwriters, the people who write the songs, okay? That's, to me, really the biggest factor in all of this. But the creative act also manifests with those involved in the production and engineering of the albums, right? And also those aligned with the business dealings of the band. Okay. And the business dealings can be either sort of day to day or maybe those involved in the more long-term vision of the band. Right. Okay. So to me, that's the key. So once we can determine which band members are most responsible for the creative side of the band, not performance, but creative side of the band, then to me, it becomes clearer which band members are absolutely necessary as the band goes forward, even if there are changes in the personnel. Okay, so I'll put that all together for you as we go forward. But that's why it's really important to understand that this framework, it really relates to understanding who are the people most responsible for creating the material, right? And that comes down to the songwriting, that comes down to the production and engineering, it comes down to some of the business stuff. Okay, well, here's the thing. This works really, really well, actually, for hard rock and heavy metal, because as opposed to other forms of music, I don't know, say classical or even the blues to a large degree, hard rock and heavy metal groups, by and large, are the authors of their own material. They write their own stuff, basically. Metal bands and hard rock bands, they write their own stuff, right? Now, great performances of songs are crucial, right? I'm not saying it's irrelevant. They're crucial and most certainly sell the group and also help develop the group's character, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the writers who are the essence of the group. It's the band members who are doing the songwriting in particular that make the group, okay? It's what makes Slayer, right? Essentially, as a good example. Let me put it this way. I mean, your chops would have to be pretty good, but really anybody could play Slayer's music if you have the chops, right? But not everybody, in fact, only a few people can write Slayer music, right? So the band would not have been Slayer without the writing talents of particularly Kerry King and the late, great Jeff Hanneman, right? And to some degree, Tom Uriah. If you look at the writing credits on any typical Slayer album, right, really any album other than the last one, right, you'll see that the lion's share of the material is written by Jeff Hanneman and Kerry King. And then there's always maybe 2 or 3 songs where Tom Uriah has a writing credit, right? And usually he's co-writing with Jeff Hanneman is really how it turns out, right? So what makes Slayer essentially Slayer is the writing talents of 2 members in particular with Tom Uriah chipping in here and there, right? But we're leaving somebody out here. As great as Dave Lombardo's drumming is, right? And of course, Dave Lombardo, longtime Slayer drummer, he didn't drum on all their albums. There's quite a few actually that Paul Bustoff drums on, right? But hey, Dave Lombardo, one of my all-time favorite drummers, no question. Certainly my favorite drummer in thrash. I think he's the absolute king. But there is no real evidence to suggest that Slayer would have evolved any differently whether Dave was part of the band or not. And I'm talking even from the beginning, right? Because Dave Lombardo didn't write, okay? So whether Dave was Slayer's drummer or not, Slayer would have still more or less have been Slayer regardless of who was drumming. Would they have been as impressive performance-wise? Probably not, but they still would have essentially been the same band, right? But there's no way they would have been the same band if Kerry King wasn't there or if Jeff Hanneman wasn't there in particular, and to some degree even Tom Uriah. But I would argue especially Jeff and Kerry, because they were the key writers in the band, right? Okay, so as I say, if you have the chops, lots of people could play Angel of Death, right? But only one person could have written Angel of Death, and that was Jeff Hanneman. So creation, not performance. That's what matters here. Okay. All right. Now, song and album production is also integral to the creation process, as I was saying too. So I think songwriting is the number one, but also, album and song production is also important. Now, what happens here? Well, lots of bands will self-produce their own material, right? Jimmy Page is a good example for Led Zeppelin. I think he produced, if not all of Led Zeppelin's albums, most of them, right? And he was certainly very involved in the production process, right? Other bands rely on outside producers and/or engineers who often can be very hands-on in some cases. A good example would be, say, Bob Ezrin, who produced a lot of early Alice Cooper. Very influential on the band. I mean, Alice himself has said in many interviews that Bob Ezrin was like a sixth member of the group because he, in a lot of ways, he almost invented the Alice Cooper sound. Alice has said that, right? And as a lot of you know, Bob Ezrin, got on board with the Alice Cooper band at the third album at Easy Action and produced quite a few albums after that, right? Lots of other bands have specific members who work very closely with outside producers as well. A good example might be with Iron Maiden. Steve Harris worked very closely with Martin Birch, who produced a lot of Iron Maiden's albums through the years. Another good example would be Eddie Van Halen working really closely with engineer Don Landee, right? Eddie, again, in lots of interviews, Eddie said that Don was very responsible in helping Eddie achieve that famous Brown sound, right? Okay, so the point I'm making here, clearly group members who are highly aligned with the production process are more integral to the group's sound than those who participate less, right? So just like you got, the key songwriters in the band are more integral to the group, right? I would, from the creation standpoint, so are those most closely aligned with the production, okay? And then sort of the third part of the framework, while perhaps not as directly associated with the creative process, still really important. No band survives without a professional business approach, right? So that you got to add that into as well as into this sort of creative framework, if you like. So like producers and engineers, much of the band's business is often delegated to various managers, but it's typical that certain band members are more involved in keeping the group financially viable than others, or they make the key decisions for the bands, right? Few bands are truly democratic, okay? Usually, I mean, and you can, it doesn't take too long. You just got to read up on different bands and dig into their history a little bit. And you can usually determine this, that few bands are truly democratic, okay? Usually there's one person in the band that's sort of the leader. They take care of, or they're most involved in the business dealings of the band. They're most involved in determining the direction of the band, that sort of thing, right? Usually it's one person, sometimes it's two or three, but somewhat ironically, if it is often two or three, usually those bands end up splitting up because they don't usually get along after a little while, right? Okay, so therefore, in my view, band members that are key writers, either they're the producers themselves or they're closely aligned with the production process for the group, or are the key business practitioners, carry special significance to the band's legacy that outweighs performance, okay? So again, you have to determine who are the big creators in a band, and then that's what gives you a clear view of, if a band should carry on as key members come and go, okay? And I think that, like I say, it outweighs performance by a lot, I think, and usually people seem to think of it the other way around. So crafting the musical material and keeping the band a going concern can be objectively obsessed. That's kind of the beauty of this, I think, as it's usually clear who the business or visionary leaders are, right? Again, you might have to do a little bit of digging, but you can almost always find that out about almost any band, right? And songwriting And to a large degree, production as well. You can always get that on the album jackets, right? So you can always find out, you can always look on the album and say, okay, who's writing the songs here, right? And you can always determine that. Admittedly, there's a little gray area here, I will admit. I mean, we read about this from time to time where a band member will say, you know what? I actually had a lot to do with writing song X, but I didn't get writing credits, for political reasons or legal reasons or whatever. That absolutely does happen. Or there's some cases where the opposite occurs, right? Where all band members are listed in the writing credits when in fact it's only maybe one or two that really did the writing. So that does happen. But my point is, it's usually pretty easy to start to see the trends, right? You're always going to be able to cherry pick the odd song here and there that maybe is not as accurately depicted in the credits as it could be. But you're always going to be able to determine the broad strokes, right? Just by looking at the credits, you're going to be able to determine fairly quickly who are the key writers in the band and who are not. So any fan can determine that, I think, right? In contrast, so that's creation. In contrast, any group member's performance, whether it's on record or live, no matter how great it might be or how captivating, right? It's still very subjective. It's still eye of the beholder, or I guess essentially ear of the beholder in this case, right? So personal preferences aside, the reality is that performance can be largely substituted, right? Whereas songwriting and the overall creation process clearly cannot. Okay, it's objective. We can measure who's the most creative members in the band. Generally speaking, as fans, we can do that. But performance is always going to be just purely opinion. Okay. Whereas, as I was saying too, and then adding to that, performance can be substituted. Anybody with good chops can play Angel of Death, but creation can't be substituted. Only one person could have written Angel of Death, right? Is sort of my point. Or another example, when Ronnie James Dio sang Iron Man, he certainly put his own spin on the Black Sabbath classic. I mean, there was no mistaking. It was pretty clear that wasn't Ozzy. That was certainly somebody new, and it was Ronnie James Dio. So we knew that. And he sang Iron Man in quite a few tours. But it didn't matter how many times Dio sang Iron Man or anybody else sang Iron Man. It was still universally recognized as Iron Man. Okay? In contrast, so that's performance. In contrast, if Dio was originally involved with, say, writing Iron Man during the 1970 Paranoid writing sessions, of course he wasn't, it was Ozzy, but let's just say it was Dio, right? There's every reason to believe that Iron Man would have sounded very different and perhaps not even existed, okay? Like, let's just pretend it was Dio who was involved in writing Iron Man, not just performing it later. It would have been a completely different animal, right? And we can guess this, I think, fairly accurately just by how Ronnie has approached writing throughout his career. Ronnie James Dio wrote his own lyrics. He came up with his own melodies, right? There's every reason that he did that in Black Sabbath, like later on when he joined them, right? There's every reason to believe that if he would have been involved in writing Iron Man, right? Iommi, no doubt, would have come up with the riffs, as he always does. But it probably Geezer wouldn't have written the lyrics because Ronnie writes his own lyrics, right? So not only would we, and no question, the melody would have been different. Dio sings completely different than Ozzy, like virtually all the time, right? So probably we might not have even had the same subject matter, Iron Man. Who knows if Dio would have went along with the idea of Iron Man? Probably not. Probably, who knows? But it's safe to say it would have been a completely different song. The lyrics would have been different. Everything, right? Okay, so the point is, importantly, once Iron Man was created, it no longer mattered who performed it going forward in relation to the persistence of the Black Sabbath name. Okay, is sort of my point here. So there's a big difference between performance and creation, and it's understanding who the key creators were that gives us the idea of, if a band should carry on or not. Okay, so let's apply this framework a little bit with a few examples. So if you accept the premise that those group members who are most crucial in terms of music creativity and business intellect can lay greater claim over the group's name, then it becomes clear when band monikers can justifiably be extended when membership changes. And I think that'll make it clear in most cases. I mean, there's going to always be some cases where it's just a dog's breakfast and we're never going to really come to any consensus. But I think in a lot of cases, this is going to help a lot with the discussion. And really, though, it only matters for bands that lean towards the Deep Purple paradigm and not the Led Zeppelin paradigm, right? I mean, again, if you're a band like Led Zeppelin and you didn't continue on after an original member leaves or dies or whatever, then there's no need for this framework, and there's not much to say. It's bands that lean more towards the Deep Purple paradigm that there's a lot more discussion, and I think this is where this framework can be helpful. Okay, so we're going to look at 5 different examples of applying this framework, 2 of which I'll cover in this part 2, and then the other 3 I'm going to leave for part 3. Again, just to keep these YouTube presentations manageable. Okay, so let's look at Black Sabbath a little more precisely here in terms of this framework and why I've come to the conclusion. So I'll jump to the punchline here. I have come to the conclusion that it's completely justifiable that the Black Sabbath name continue on with all kinds of different lineups as long as Tony Iommi was in it, right? That's sort of my opinion on this. And I'll show you why I've come to that conclusion based on this framework. Okay, so go back to the start with Black Sabbath. While all 4 original members were given equal writing credits on the first 8 Black Sabbath albums, so from Black Sabbath to Never Say Die to all those amazing albums in between, right? Ozzy, Geezer, Bill, and Tony were given equal credits for songwriting. It became widely understood that Tony Iommi was the driving force in musical creation, not performance. Well, he was no slouch there either, but in musical creation is what we're talking about here. All right. That's common knowledge. Okay. It's become common knowledge. So much has been written on it. Every band member has admitted that, right? Whether it be Ozzy, whether it be Geezer, whether it be Bill, it's said that Tony Iommi was the driving force musically of the band. Most of Black Sabbath songs were structured around Iommi's riffs. And then the lyrics, by and large, came from Geezer Butler, Ozzy here and there, but mostly it was Geezer. The melody lines came from Ozzy. Really, that's always been Ozzy's genius, are the melody lines, whether it be in Sabbath or a solo, it's his melody lines. And Bill Ward provided various musical embellishments that were not inconsequential. So I'm not saying the other guys didn't have important input. Of course they did. But the driving creative force was Tony Iommi. The other members say it. Producers have said it. Anybody inside the Sabbath camp, it's been written over and over. It really is about Iommi. Incidentally, building songs around guitar riffs became a heavy metal staple, hard rock too, for countless other bands, and this is perhaps the greatest debt owed to Sabbath and Iommi in particular, right? And I think that, other bands were doing that too at the time, like they were building sounds around riffs, but I don't think any band, did it so deliberately and so perfectly as Black Sabbath, right? So for all the things we owe Black Sabbath for the importance of heavy music, that might be the biggest. Right, building songs around the almighty riff, and the riff meister, i.e., Tony Iommi, is kind of the king of that. Okay, at any rate, the creative milieu of Black Sabbath can be viewed very succinctly. No Iommi, no songs. Right, that's really what the situation in Black Sabbath was, or certainly we wouldn't have gotten the songs that we know now. Without Iommi, you're not getting these songs, basically. Right. But it doesn't just end there with Iommi, right? I think that's the most crucial thing. The most crucial songwriter was Iommi, and that's just understood. But Tony Iommi was the band member most involved in the production process. Remember, with the framework, I always say songs are the most important thing, but also production and business side too. Well, Iommi was the band member most involved in the production. Again, book after book about Black Sabbath will tell you that, right? Sometimes Tony was the actual producer, although I don't know if he was ever given sole credit. I think on Technical Ecstasy might be one. but he was always the guy working the most closely with the producers. Along with Bill Ward at times, Iommi was also the guy most associated with the business dealings in Black Sabbath. Now, fair enough. In the early days of Sabbath, none of the guys were very good at the business side, because that's why they all got ripped off so much by shady managers and lawyers and et cetera, et cetera. But later on, Iommi and to some degree Bill Ward were sort of the most important people in terms of the business side as well, right? So while fans are free to endlessly debate who did the best rendition of War Pigs performance, okay? So does Ozzy do the best version of War Pigs? Was it Theo? Was it Ian Gillan? Was it Glenn Hughes? Was it Tony Martin? Was it Ray Gillan? On it goes, right? Or fans are free, of course, to endlessly debate which post-Ozzy albums they like best. They're all the best. Well, that's me anyway. I think it's completely justifiable that the Black Sabbath name persisted throughout all the lineup changes, which actually included not just a lot of different vocalists, but quite a few different drummers and bassists as well, because it always had its creative guru at the helm, i.e. Tony Iommi, okay? And just to take this even a little bit further, as such, I never agreed with the Iommi, Butler, Dio, Appice configuration calling themselves Heaven and Hell. A lot of you will know that sort of the last couple tours of that line, the Dio lineup with again Iommi and Dio and Appice, didn't call themselves Black Sabbath at the end. They called themselves Heaven and Hell. So for the last couple tours, as well as the last album, The Devil You Know, don't overlook that album. It's a gem. All right. But it's not called Black Sabbath. It's called Heaven and Hell. I think that's completely Boulder Dash. That lineup to me is as Black Sabbath as any of the others, right? This to me was Black Sabbath in everything other than name, right? The only thing this dubious situation established is that actors like Sharon Osbourne and a legion of lawyers can undermine common sense. And well, I don't know what you think of that. It'd be cool to hear about your comments, but that's how I see it. So as long as Tony Iommi's in the band, it's Black Sabbath, full stop, because he's the creative force. Okay. So you sort of see how I'm applying the framework here. Okay. Well, I've already mentioned a couple things about Uriah Heep. Let's dig into Uriah Heep a little more precisely and sort of see where things stand on that. Well, again, I'll give you the punchline on this one. While there are a lot of similarities between the Black Sabbath situation and the Uriah Heep situation, and both actually follow the Deep Purple paradigm quite well, I actually have a fairly different opinion about Uriah Heep than I do with Black Sabbath. So I'll kind of show you how I've come to these conclusions. So, like Black Sabbath, Uriah Heep definitely falls in line with the Deep Purple paradigm and probably is about as far from the Zeppelin model as you can get. We mentioned with Deep Purple and in part one, Deep Purple has, 7 different marks or 7 different recording lineups, if you like, right? Well, you could add a couple more to that with Uriah Heep. There's been a lot. They've probably driven the purists crazy over the years, or perhaps the purists just stopped paying attention after Demons and Wizards or something. But anyway, however, unlike Sabbath and probably Purple, it's difficult to rationalize the long-running use of the Uriah Heep moniker, which extends from 1970 to the present. So I think this one's a lot harder to justify keeping Uriah Heep the name as long as they have. Okay. So I'm not going to document all of the deviations of Uriah Heep. Again, other websites will do a better job of that. But I am going to talk about some highlights in relation to the framework and how I came to the conclusion of, the Heep name probably should have been retired a number of years ago. Okay. It is safe to assume that most people consider the band Uriah Heep's classic lineup to be David Byron, vocalist, Ken Hensley, Hammond organ player, slide guitar player, Mick Box, lead guitar player, Gary Thane, bassist, and Lee Kerslake, the drummer. Okay, most people will consider that the classic Heep lineup. And they'll say that largely on the strength of their best known material, which by and large is on the following albums. Demons and Wizards, I'm sure would be considered probably their most popular album of 1972. The Magician's Birthday would probably be a close second, I would imagine. The live album of 73 is also a very well-known popular album, and then Sweet Freedom, right? So a lot of people would point to that as the classic lineup because they spawned those albums. Other people would maybe be a little more liberal with what the classic period of Uriah Heep is, and they probably would extend it backwards to include the first 3 albums as well. So that would be 1970s Very Heavy, Very Humble, Salisbury, and Look at Yourself of 1971. Although be aware, if you do consider that the classic period of Heep, and a lot of people do, we're not talking about one lineup here, okay? Because by the time they get to Demons and Wizards, they've already changed drummers and bassists a couple times. So, again, we're at Mark 2 and 3 already with Uriah Heep here. Okay, so these early Heep rosters had a distinct sound. Performance-wise, they were amazing, no question. The sound was around Byron's lead vocals, Box's wah-wah guitar solo. Still the king of wah-wah was Mick, and still is, I believe. Hensley's grinding Hammond organ, and a very underrated slide guitarist, by the way. The band's harmony vocals, which was a huge and still is a trademark of the band, and to some, the very important bass lines of Gary Thane. People who deep dive on Uriah Heep will always rave about what a great bass player Gary Thane was. I believe he's one of the greatest bass players ever in hard rock. I really believe that. Okay, so while these performance-based attributes are impressive, and Heep is an amazing band, the driving force of the band's creativity came mostly from Ken Hensley. So again, I'm driving home this idea that you have to distinguish where the creative core is in bands, and then you can determine where band names should stop, if in fact that should be the case. So the band's creative core was Ken Hensley. All you got to do is look at the writing credits of Uriah Heep, and it becomes, you can see a very distinct trend. I mean, yes, there's a handful of Box Byron collaborations on songs. Sometimes they collaborate in conjunction with Lee or with Gary Thane, right? That's true. And there's a few of them out there, and there's some great, and they wrote some really good songs too, don't get me wrong. But Hensley wrote the vast majority of the material through all these classic albums that I just named, right? The exception is the very first one, the very first Uriah Heep album, where Hensley isn't giving any writing credits. But again, I've seen enough interviews with Ken Hensley over the years where he stated he actually had a lot to do with that first album, but his name was left off the credits for legal reasons. Okay, so whether you buy that or not really doesn't matter. The lion's share of the writing of Uriah Heep, whether you consider the first album or not, it's overwhelmingly Ken Hensley. Okay. In fact, some of these albums were initially conceptualized by Ken Hensley alone. Good example is The Magician's Birthday, which was based on his short story. So not only was he the main songwriter, he also was the guy who conceptualized most of their albums anyway, right? So again, he was the creative force in the band at that time. But it gets even a little deeper here with Hensley. Jerry Braun was not only the band's producer from 1970 to 1980, but he also was the band's main manager. Okay, and he was most responsible for the band's business affairs. Well, as it turns out, the one band member in Uriah Heep that worked most closely with Jerry Braun was Ken Hensley. Right. So Ken is working most closely with the producer as well as the business guy. Right. So this is just elevating Ken's status even more on the creative side, because he's not only is he the key songwriter, like by a long shot, right, but he's also the guy most involved in the production of the albums and also in the business dealings, because he worked most closely with Jerry Braun. Incidentally, that did, from what I've read, that did cause, some hard feelings with other band members, but it is what it is, right? So eventually we start to see more changes in Uriah Heep. Maybe one of the most significant changes, at least early on, was when charismatic David Byron was replaced by John Lawton for the incredibly underrated Firefly album. Love that album. But Innocent Victim and Fallen Angel are also great albums, right? So John Lawton replaces David Byron, original vocalist, and very popular, one of the greatest frontmen of all time, I would say. And then John Sloman replaces John Lawton for Conquest in 1980, an album that wasn't quite as well received. But here's the point I'm making. At least up until Conquest, I believe the persistence of the Uriah Heep name was still completely justifiable. We've had a lot of lineup changes by the time we get to 1980. Okay, yes, some very key lead vocal changes. But again, as we said, there's bassists have come and gone, drummers have come and gone, etc. But I think it's completely fine that Uriah Heep is still called Uriah Heep up to this point, because you still have Hensley as the creative force, right? I mean, if you look at the songwriting credits, you know, even in the John Layton era or the Lawton era, it's virtually all Hensley, right? Like Firefly, Innocent Victim, Fallen Angel. He virtually writes the entire albums by himself. Right. I mean, he was the writer early on. I mean, you had some chip-ins from Mick Box and David Byron, et cetera. But by the time you know, now he's completely taken over creative control of the band at this point. Right. So because of that, because you've always had Hensley, I think it was always justifiable that you're calling it Uriah Heep, because that creative consistency that you were getting because of Hensley. But big change, right? This continuity is shattered at the time of Abominog, which was put out in 1982. An amazing album, absolutely amazing album. But it no longer, at least to me, is Uriah Heep. Why? It has no tangible connection to the creative legacy of early Uriah Heep albums, because Ken Hensley is gone at this point. Ken Hensley leaves before they do Abominog, and he's never on another Uriah Heep album after that, if you don't count a couple guest appearances on live albums, but he's never been on another studio album. Okay. So Ken Hensley moves on, and the band is now unambiguously anchored around Mick Box. All right. And at this point, at Abominog, Mick is the only original member at this point, although longtime drummer Lee Kerstlake remains in tow. But remember, Lee was not an original member. Also, it's at this point at which the band disengages from producer-manager Jerry Braun. So you lose your main songwriter, by far your main songwriter, and you've also lost that connection with Hensley's connecting with the producer and the business manager, et cetera. That's all gone, right? So it really is a clean break in many, many ways, right? So even though Box occupied the all-important heavy rock lead guitar position, this was not enough to keep serious debate at bay amongst the punters regarding the continued use of the Uriah Heep brand. And in my opinion, because the creative, there's been such a change in the creative center of Uriah Heep, this is when Uriah Heep should have ceased as in name, right? After Hensley's departure, Mick Box became central in the songwriting process. I mean, Mick was always important. I mean, I don't want to devalue that the other guys in Heep didn't do anything. They were always really important. But Hensley was clearly the creative force when he was in the band. But once he's gone, after Abominog, it shifts clearly to Mick Box. Mick Box becomes the primary songwriter. He certainly becomes the guy most important on the business side of things, right? So he becomes the focal point of the band creatively. I'm not even talking about performance, because Mick's always been important for performance. But creatively, it's shifted to Mick very clearly. So initially, Mick conspired with various band members to produce the bulk of material featured on the so-called Peter Golby era. So Peter Golby was the vocalist on Abominog, as well as Head First and Equator. And then since that time, since Raging Silence, 1989 to the present, right, we're in the Bernie Shaw era of the band, if you like, where Bernie Shaw, longtime vocalist now. Box has cultivated a really fertile writing relationship with keyboardist Phil Lanson, right? So if you look at the Uriah Heep albums since Raging Silence, so there's been a lot of albums since then, right? Most of the songwriting now is Box and Lanson, right? With Box being the focal point, again, because of being the prime business guy and all that kind of stuff, but also key songwriter. Okay. Although it should be mentioned that Trevor Bolder also wrote a number of songs in the later parts of Uriah Heep. Trevor Bolder was in the band with Ken Hensley, but his role was much more secondary in terms of songwriting. He wrote a lot more songs once Ken left. But still, the main songwriters have been Mick Box and Phil Lanson. Okay, so even with the numerous changes that occurred after Ken Hensley left, right? I think it's completely justifiable that the band keep the same name after Abominog, right? Because now the creative center is all around Mick Box, and he is consistently with them all the way through, right? So I think you're fine calling the band the same name from Abominog right up to the present. But I don't believe it should have been called Uriah Heep. Okay. I think that stops when you lose Hensley because there was too much of a change after. Really, Hensley was just too important from a creative standpoint for the band to carry on, with the same name after. They were fundamentally too changed without Hensley as it goes to Mick Box. So the fairly complex tracking of Uriah Heep's creative core can be distilled down to one monstrous shift, really, when Box succeeds Hensley. And at this point in time, continuing with the Uriah Heep name is at its most controversial. And frankly, I believe it's the hardest to justify, at least if you get beyond commercial motivations. Perhaps Abominog should have been a self-titled album and the band's new namesake, right? So maybe, I believe it shouldn't have been called Uriah Heep after that. And again, the music's still amazing, so I'm not even commenting on performance. But because the creative center had shifted so drastically, the band should have probably been called Abominog or maybe a better band name, but something other than Uriah Heep. But after that, it's perfectly justifiable the band keeps the same name because now Mick Box is firmly in control at the creative center. Anyway, so hopefully you get the idea of how I'm trying to apply this framework. Please feel free to check out part 3 if you're finding this interesting. I'm going to apply the framework to 3 more examples. We're going to look at Megadeth, we're going to look at Venom, and we're going to look at Kiss. And all 3 of these bands, as you probably know, have continued with their monikers in spite of very significant lineup changes through the years. And you'll see sort of how I apply the framework to each of these situations. And you'll also see the conclusions I draw in terms of which of these bands were justified in keeping their name throughout time and which probably a lot less so. Thank you for checking this out and have a terrific day.